All right, so let's talk about gates. Gates are a great tool to control when something comes through the PA system and when it doesn't. This is primarily used on things like drums because there's a lot of microphones on a drum kit, and each one of them would start picking up every other instrument that's inside of there. Say, for example, the snare mic can also hear the kick drum, the toms, the cymbals. We only want that snare mic to pick up the snare. So we only want it to have the snare sound come through that microphone into our system when it's time for it to happen. So how do we do that? Well, gates are specifically designed to fulfill this role. Gates listen to the signal source that we have, say, for example, our snare microphone, and when something hits that volume level that we set, that we predetermined, and it goes over that limit, then we know to let the signal come through the PA, and then when it goes below it, after waiting the appropriate amount of time, it turns the microphone off and stops coming through the PA. Let me actually show you what that looks like in practicality. So, for example, here I've got a snare drum, and we're going to turn it up here. And as you can hear everything that's happening inside that snare drum right now. You're hearing that cymbal. You can kind of hear the kick drum a little bit too. We don't want any of that from our snare drum microphone coming into the system, because that plus all the other mics opened up on there, it's just going to be a ton of drum noise, and we're going to have all kinds of issues with our mix. So let's look at how we can use a gate to clean this up. So let's bring this snare in. Let me go to a different section here. And let's just turn on the gate and see where we're at. Okay, so nothing's happening right now, and that's because our threshold is set too low. It's saying, hey, this is all hitting the volume level that I want to hear to turn things open, to turn on the microphone. So let's turn that threshold up. So it has to be a stronger signal to open it up. Okay. So now, as you can hear, that snare's only opening up when the snare hits. Let's crank it up more. All right, so now it's really only opening up when that snare's hit. So we could just stop there and call it a day, right? Well, you could, but let's look at some of the other options we have here, because there's a couple other things that we need to consider when it comes to using this gate, specifically attack times, hold times, release times, and depth. So let's listen to what those things do. So first, we're looking at attack, and we're going to set it all the way to the right, where it's as slow as possible. And we'll start this over again. So as you can hear, we're barely hearing that snare drum come through, because what's happening is that attack time is taking way too long to open up the gate all the way after the snare has been hit. And what's happening is that it's actually closing faster than it is opening, because our release is quicker than our attack. So attack time is really this. It's how quickly do we respond to that initial hit, or what's called the transient, opening up the gate. When we hit that threshold mark, how quickly do we respond? Do we wait 300 milliseconds in this case, like we're listening right now, or do we do it as instantaneous as possible? So let's turn it the other direction and listen now. We'll go back to a section here where we can hear it. So now you can hear almost immediately that snare is opening up the moment it's being hit. And that's the whole idea behind attack, is that we want it to be, in this case, very, very fast. We want to hear that initial hit right away. We don't want to wait. Now, sometimes having a slower attack is good because it can be part of your sound. So let's take a listen to how that can sound in a not as dramatic way as we had earlier. So I don't know if you noticed that, but the drummer didn't actually start playing softer. What happened was that we are telling the gate to open up just a little bit after the initial transient or hit. So what actually happened is that the very, very initial burst of energy, that first contact that we have, the snare stick or the drumstick hitting the snare, is actually ducked down. So it's not nearly as snappy. It's not nearly as in your face and as loud as it was previously. So we can actually use that that gate to help soften the hits up a little bit on our mix. Let's take a listen again here and listen to the difference between it being super fast and a little more medium style attack. So we'll speed it up here. And we'll start slowing it down. You can hear how it kind of got a little bit softer. It's not nearly as in your face up front. That's the whole idea that you can use the attack for, is you can control that initial transient of how loud it is up front. Now let's talk about the hold and release times. So hold time is how long after that spike or after that initial volume change over the threshold until it goes below it, do we keep the gate open? So once that signal hits below the threshold, how long do we wait until we engage the release time, which is how slowly or fast do we close the gate? So a long hold time is going to say, okay, if I have the snare hit and it opens up the gate, I'm going to wait. Okay, the signal's come through and now it's gone down. I'm going to wait until the hold time is over, and then I'm going to start closing the gate, okay? All right, so let's listen to what this sounds like with the hold all the way as fast as possible and the attack all the way as fast as possible. So we're at 10 milliseconds on the hold, meaning it's waiting 10 milliseconds after the threshold's been dropped down below it. And as you can see, it's instantaneously just about starting to close that gate as soon as that snare hits. So what happens if we crank it all the way up? Well, right now we're at 5 seconds, which is way too long, obviously, because it's holding it open for the next snare to come through, which is happening quicker than 5 seconds. Let's go a little bit slower here. Let's do a second roughly. It's still too slow. It's not even getting a chance to close. So let's scroll down here. We're still too fast or slow. We're still too slow. So as you saw with the super slow hold time, it never even got to close again because we were below the threshold, but it was waiting way too long before the next one of the next hits came in, and it just started the process over again. So when we have too slow of a hold time, the microphone's going to stay open for way too long. However, if we do it way too fast, then what happens is that we actually will cut off some of the tone afterwards. In fact, let's do this. Let's listen to what a super fast hold time and a super fast release time sound like to demonstrate what release does. So we're going to set our attack to as quick as it can go, our hold to as quick as it can go, and our release to as quick as it can go. Let's listen. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very good. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening is that our signal hits the gate, it opens up right away, and then it doesn't wait very long before it starts closing the gate, and then the gate slams shut. So we're hearing about 0.1 second of a snare drum hit. We're barely hearing any of it coming through the PA. So what are we doing with the release time? Well, the release time, again, is how quickly does that gate close? And right now it's set to slam shut the moment it's time to release. So let's slow down the release here and listen to what that sounds like. So I'm going to turn it back up again. As you can see, we're starting to hear more of the tone of the snare. We'll start this over. There we go. Now, inversely, what we could do is we could also change the hold time. And what you can hear is that how long that hold time is now. But what's happening still is that the door is slamming shut after the hold time's over. So what's the point we're trying to get here with the gate? Well, the idea here is that we're trying to set our attack, hold, and release times in a way that it's musical and that we're not sucking the life out of the drum kit and all the individual mics, but we're actually letting each one ring out and resonate the way it needs to naturally and then close down so we don't hear that microphone and the stuff around it anymore. This is especially important and very true to need to be done when it comes to things like toms, which are much more sustained instruments compared to a snare, which is just a very quick initial hit. So let's listen to what we can do to really dial this attack, hold, and release time in for this gate on this snare drum. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to reset this gate here. We'll turn it on. And we're going to set our threshold back up here again. And this is a pretty good starting point, I would say. It's not super long of a hold. It's not super quick of a release. In fact, if anything, it may need to be a little bit quicker. And I think we're going to tighten the hold time down just a bit too. Let's see what a faster release time sounds like here. Okay, so that's sucking the life out of it. That's too much. Now, if we slowed it down too much, we're getting a little bit too much of the cymbals in there. So we're going to dial this release back down to, let's do 100 milliseconds. And this isn't a fast number by any means, a hard fast number. This is just the number I'm picking right now. That's feeling pretty good. I'm actually pretty happy with that. Now let's mess with this thing called depth. Depth is basically how much are we cutting the signal when the gate's closed. If I were to open it all the way up, we're currently not cutting any signal. The gate's basically off. Versus if I do this, versus this where we cut the microphone down entirely now. And in some ways, that actually sounds pretty good. But in the mix of everything, it may sound a little bit weird because what's happening is that we're hearing that cymbal coming through that snare mic as well. And it's just going to be this kind of and we're going to have that blending in with the rest of the kit. And so every time that snare goes off, that's going to kind of be a part of the sound. And it's going to feel a little odd to have that big of a difference. So having the depth a little bit higher where it's a little bit more of a blendedness where the snare opens up and then it kind of closes just enough that we don't feel the rest of it as upfront in the mix is going to make it a little more natural, especially when we start adding things in like overhead mics into our mix. So let's listen to the gate now that we've set everything where we have it at. We're going to have it was at 20. That I find has still too much cymbal in it, so we're going to pull it down to 30. And that feels pretty good. Now, we can go a step further and really making sure that our gate is opening correctly by using what's called a key or a sidechain. So first we have what's called the key for the sidechain. And this is what input signal do we want to listen to judge what our threshold is. So you technically can set a totally different microphone or instrument to be the key to say when the gate goes off, which is really wild to think about. You could set your bass guitar to open up your snare microphone. And it's not practical. It doesn't make any sense to do, but you can. So when does this make sense to do it? Well, a lot of times you might see these little drum triggers on drums where they just send out the acoustic response of you hitting that snare or hitting the tom, and it just sends out a little pulse and voltage. That's not really something you want to listen to, but it's a signal that our soundboards can see as voltage or an audio spike, and you could listen to that signal because it's not a microphone picking up all the other things. It's only picking up the sound or the vibration of you hitting the drum and set that as your gate key. That's a really cool advantage of these systems that you can use where you can say, hey, listen to another input and judge that signal to be what spikes and opens up the gate. Now, let's go to the next section below, which, as you can see here, has this button here that says high pass filter, band pass filter, or low pass filter. And then below it, we've got a frequency selection plus the in button. So what is this section for? This is for selecting what frequency range we want to focus our gate to. Now, on a more higher end console or in some studio plugins that you may have for your computer, you can really see and dial this in. But in this case here, what we're looking at is just some fixed frequencies. So our high pass filter says, okay, from this frequency on up, these are the frequencies we're going to listen to. So we're cutting all the low end information out, versus a bandpass filter, which is going to say what's the center frequency we're going to listen to out of the whole spectrum. And then a low pass filter, which is saying, okay, ignore the high information from this point down was what we're listening to. So let's listen to what that would, how that affects our gate. So we'll turn on our high pass filter. It's set to 20 hertz, which is basically a full frequency spectrum. So we're going to hear everything the snare mic would normally hear. But let's crank it up. All right. Now we're at 5 kilohertz, which is very high up there. And it's now kind of not doing much. It's actually not even opening the gate. And the reason is because, one, the energy level or the voltage level of 5 kilohertz and up on this snare mic is not nearly as much as everything else below 5 kilohertz. So it's not setting the gate off. Let's actually listen to what 5 kilohertz and above sound like on this snare drum mic. So I've set up an EQ where we're cutting off 5 kilohertz and below, and let's listen to what it sounds like. So as you can hear, we're only hearing the snare wires, we're hearing the ping of the cymbals, but that's it. There's not a lot of information to this drum now. It's all just kind of the high end. Now let's take the EQ off and hear what it sounds like without it. So there's a lot of mid-range in that boomness to the snare that we're missing now. And that's a lot louder than the 5 kilohertz. So what we actually could do is, instead of using a high pass filter to focus the snare key on the gate, we could actually go do the inverse and listen to the low pass filter. So let's listen to what that sounds like. So we're going to change this to low pass. We'll start at 20 kilohertz and work our way down. So just like before, not a lot's happening. We're going to dial this down. Let's go all the way down. All right, so now we're at 120 hertz. A lot more information there, not enough to set the gate off at the threshold we've set to, but it's going off more now because there's more energy in the snare drum at this frequency range and below. So 120 hertz and below, we're hearing more of the sub information, the low mid information, and that's actually triggering the gate. So how is that useful? Well, right now, none of the toms, the kick drum, for this example, is not triggering it. And the cymbals are definitely not triggering the snare to open up. So we've actually cut all that information off and said, just focus on this frequency and below, and we're only going to use that to choose our gate setting. So we've made it so that way the gate has less information to work with that could interfere with it being triggered falsely. And it actually makes its job easier. Now we're going to look at the bandpass one in here, what that sounds like. So let's set it to bandpass and we'll leave it at 120 hertz just to start with and see what happens. So already this is working because 120 hertz, there's a lot of information in the snare drum that actually is around that air region where it focuses on just that. We could also boost this up to 400 hertz. And in fact, if you look at the EQ here in our RTA, we've got a ton of information from 200 hertz all the way up to 2 kilohertz. There's a ton of information to work with here that we can focus on. But if you look at the spikes of information, that 200-ish, 150-ish to 500 area really seems to be the sweet spot for the snare. So if we were to focus our bandpass there, we're going to hear mostly just that, and it's going to trigger off the snare a lot better. Now, do you have to use keys and side chains to get the best gate sound? No, you don't. But do they help? Absolutely. Sometimes you're going to have issues where other drums or other instruments are going to start affecting your gates and falsely triggering them. Or your gates aren't going to trigger as accurately as you would like. Maybe they don't trigger as often as they should because the threshold has to be set too high to avoid other things bleeding into it. That's where using your sidechain and setting your key filter is appropriate and helps get a better gate sound.